Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Um, my name is Joseph Houston, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This year marks the 27th season of Great Falls Forum. We thank you for your continued support and ensuring the program's continued success. Today's program is also live streaming via Zoom, and a recording will be available on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. Please mark your calendars for our next Great Falls Forum on May 15th with Hannah Pingree, Director of Governor Mills' Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise their hands, and those joining us virtually can enter their questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll read these to our speaker. Now I have the pleasure of introducing today's featured speaker, Monica Wood. Monica Wood is a novelist, memoirist, and playwright, the 2024 recipient of the Sarah Josepha Hale Award for Excellence in the Arts in New England, the 2019 Constance Carlson Prize for contributions to the public humanities in Maine, and the 2018 Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance Distinguished Achievement Award for her contributions to literary arts. Her newest novel, How to Read a Book, has already secured translation rights in 5 countries. Her previous novel, the best-selling The One in a Million Boy, which, by the way, I'm reading currently, was translated into 20 languages in over 30 countries. She is also the author of When We Were the Kennedys, a New England bestseller and winner of the May Sarton Memoir Award. Her other fiction, Any Bitter Thing, Ernie's Ark, and My Only Story have also won awards and made bestseller lists. Her short stories have been widely anthologized and featured on Public Radio International. Her nonfiction and reviews have appeared in O, the New York Times, Literary Hub, Down East, the San Francisco Chronicle, Martha Stewart Living, Parade, and many other publications. She's also the author of several books for aspiring writers and 3 plays, Papermaker, The Half-Light, and Saint Dad. She lives in Portland with her husband, Dan Abbott, and their cat, Susie. Please welcome me in please join me in welcoming Monica to Lewiston.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for that lovely introduction. You know, when you put it all together like that, it sounds like, wow, that sounds pretty darn good. But I've been doing this a very long time. And when you get old, they start giving you awards. So I think I did this very forum probably 25 years ago when nobody knew who the heck I was. And so it's really nice to see everybody today. And so before I start, I really need to do my due diligence and say a word or two about my new book. Well, it's not new anymore. It's been out for a year. And my publisher just informed me that they're not going to publish the paperback for another 6 months because it's still doing well enough in hardcover, which is really good news for me and bad news for you. But I was very pleased to hear that because that has not happened before. So that's kind of great. And also, my friend Barbara Kelly is just outside the door. She runs Kelly's Books to Go. It's a freelance book selling company, and she will have books for sale, the new one and others of mine, if you want to get a book. And after this is all over, I'm happy to stay as long as I need to. If you want to get a book signed, you want to get a book, or if some people brought books, which I always find very heartening. So I will be around to do that. How to Read a Book is a novel that follows 3 characters. The first character is Violet Powell. She's a 22-year-old woman just finishing up a prison sentence for a drunk driving accident in which she killed a kindergarten teacher. And the second character is Harriet Larson, who is a retired English teacher who is the volunteer book club leader in the prison where Violet is serving her time. And the third character is Frank Daigle, who is a retired machinist who works as a bookstore handyman now. And it's set in Portland, Maine, and it's based on Longfellow books in Portland, but I call it Wadsworth books for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So it doesn't take you kind of know where you are. And the other thing is they used to have this really great big slouchy couch in there. And I've been whining about it ever since they took it out. So it is back in the fictional world of Longfellow books. So anyway, and I should add that Frank is the widower of the woman that Violet killed in the accident. So the three of these characters meet one day in the bookstore. Harriet is there because she's getting the next batch of books for book club. Frank is there because he's working. And Violet is there because she has been unceremoniously dumped in Portland, Maine. And she's not a city girl. She's really just a little country mouse. And she's scared to death. And the only thing she can think of to do is go to the nearest bookstore and get the book that they were reading in book club when she left so she can find out how it ends. This encounter fuels the plot of the book, which visits themes of forgiveness, friendship, found family, which is a theme I revisit often in my books, and also the power of books and reading. I was told that I could speak on any topic of my choice today, which can be dangerous. And I had a long speech about cats all ready to go, but my brother-in-law is here and he is not a cat man. And it's his only flaw, I will add. So instead, I would like to talk about three of my other favorite subjects, which is libraries, librarians, and books. My big sister, Ann Wood, is also here today, and she is the primary reason I was able to even think about ever becoming a writer. The first time I put pen to paper, it was probably pencil actually, was to write letters to her at college when I was 4 and 5 years old. She was my high school English teacher, and I'd be shocked if there weren't at least 2 or 3 people in here who also had her in school, because that happens everywhere I go. And she's still one of my first readers. I have to say she's a very gentle critic. She does save me from the disgrace of dangling my modifiers in public, so that is good. But her idea of criticism is to say things like, this sentence isn't as exquisitely beautiful as the one that precedes it. All writers need at least one critic like that. If I want the truth, I go to my husband, who is also here, by the way. I've always hoped that if there is a heaven, it is some version of a library. I can't imagine a better place for a writer to spend eternity. And if God turns out to be a librarian, I won't be a bit surprised. Almost every writer I know still carries a profound affection for their first library, their childhood library. And my own childhood library was the Mexico Public Library on Main Street in Mexico, next door to the town hall and directly across the river from the Oxford Paper Company, which was the town paper mill, which is still going. It's now called Nine Dragons. We never could have imagined that back then. And the second I became old enough, I got my library card and became a regular patron. The librarian at that time was a fussy little lady named Mrs. Thomas, and she was straight out of Central Casting. I remember her, maybe she didn't look like this, but in my mind, I remember her wearing a longish gray dress with a white lace collar, and she had her hair in a bun. And whenever I arrived at the door, usually with one of my sisters or a friend, she would greet us at the door with the same 2 words every single time. Something special. And there was so much that was special in that library. Heaven indeed for a little girl just falling in love with reading. It wasn't really much to look at, that library, not like the fancy brick Carnegie Library across the river in Rumford, but it did become a second home to me and to all the budding readers in our little town. Every week I borrowed the maximum amount allowed. And how many people did that as kids? The maximum allowed. Yeah. And I read them as fast as I could, just so I could read them again before I had to bring them back. One time I borrowed a book called Barbar the Elephant. Does anybody remember Barbar? And the reason I borrowed it is I loved the illustration on the cover. I didn't even open it. I just put it in with my other books that I was bringing home. And when I got it home, I was absolutely chagrined to discover that the typeface was in cursive, which I could not yet read. I remember that moment so viscerally. First of all, the mortification of selecting a book I couldn't read, and the frustration at seeing all of those indecipherable words. But at the same time, those words in cursive looked very alluring. And it's possible that looking at the impenetrable Barbar, I thought his name was Barbara, was the beginning of my fascination with how words look on a page and how their look changes when paired with other words. So Barbara the elephant might have been my first experience of loving words for themselves alone and wondering about their possibilities. It wasn't only books that I loved in that first library. It was a sense of something very hard to describe even now that I have felt in every library I have ever entered ever since. And the only word I can come up with is safety. The word is inadequate to the feeling, but there really is something about a library that makes me feel at so much ease that whenever I'm in the emotional chaos of a difficult stretch of writing, which in novel writing happens frequently and extensively, I immediately head to one of three libraries. The first is my local branch of the Portland Library, which reminds me the most of my childhood library. The other is the fancier Falmouth Library, this town right next to Portland, which is big and sunny, and they have chairs the sizes of sofas in there. It's very comfortable. Or the University of New England Library on the Portland campus, which houses the main women writers collection, where my own papers are being collected, and where I feel the grace of my main foremothers guiding my process along. And every once in a while, the library itself will influence what I'm writing. In How to Read a Book, I made Violet's mother a librarian almost by default because I wrote almost all of that book in a library. So I'm going to read this very brief passage, and the speaker is Violet, who you remember has just been released from prison. So this is her voice. My mother called me a born reader. She's a born reader, that one. I tore through just about every book in the Abbott Falls Public Library. The head librarian, Mrs. McHale, high red wig that looked like a hedge on fire. She was my favorite person from childhood. Good for you, Violet, she said whenever I checked out the maximum. My mother worked at the desk behind Mrs. McHale's, research, acquisitions, and events. And she blush smiled every time Mrs. McHale said, good for you, because my mother was thinking, good for us. I hope it's clear that having these library spaces is an enormous gift to me, as they are to so many, writers and non-writers alike. I use libraries really in only two very basic ways, to borrow books and to write books. But many other library patrons borrow things in addition to books. They borrow course materials or movies or music. The Falmouth Library has this huge stargazing telescope that you can check out of the library. And I just recently read about a library somewhere that rents, that you can borrow cookware. So it's kind of amazing the things that you can borrow from libraries these days. And in some places, especially rural places in our own state, where internet access is sketchy or non-existent or too expensive, people use libraries not only to borrow things, but to apply for jobs, to get their taxes done, to print out forms and contracts, or to connect with distant loved ones. People bring their kids to story hour, they come to readings, they participate in all kinds of classes and workshops. The reach of public libraries these days is vast and varied and vital. I delivered a keynote address a couple of years ago now And because I got there early, I went to one of the workshops, which was called something like Managing the Challenging Patron. And Joe he's like, yeah, okay, we got a couple of those. During the discussion, first of all, there was just a little presentation, and then there was a discussion, and everybody except me in the room was a librarian. So during the discussion, one of the librarians brought up a woman who called her library every single day and talked for a solid hour from noon to 1 to whoever was unlucky enough to answer the phone. And then a librarian from a different nearby library mentioned a kind of similar patron who called from 1 to 2. And then a third librarian, also in the same geographic area, said, mine calls from 2 to 3. And nobody mentioned the patron by name, but it didn't take a whole lot of sleuthing to figure out it was the same person. And all three librarians felt obligated to do what they could for this person suffering from either extraordinary loneliness or some form of mental illness, or maybe both. Being a librarian is quite different now than it was in Mrs. Thomas's time, an era when people came in just to borrow a book or study for a test. I see who comes into my downtown branch of the Portland Library to keep warm or have some time of peace, or sometimes to experience safety in the most literal sense of that word. Simultaneous with this influx of people who need libraries in various and sometimes unforeseen ways, libraries are also under siege right now from censors and school boards and town councils whose idea of reading freedom does not comport with anything I have long thought that to be. I'm really hoping that's not my phone. It isn't. Yeah, okay. Not once, not in my entire life, have I ever been prevented from reading whatever I wanted. When I was a kid, the stories that I most needed were readily available to me. I read Anne of Green Gables many, many times because in Anne, I found another freckle-faced, red-headed misfit who loved words. Watching Anne Shirley rise above her circumstances made me believe that I too could achieve my dreams. I loved Anne Shirley. I required Anne Shirley in my life. And because I found what I needed in Anne of Green Gables and many, many other books, my hope for every child is that they can find what they need in the stories available to them. And if we have learned anything in the last few years, it's that what kids need from books, and not just kids, really all of us, is more varied than we ever imagined. Stories that explore different ethnicities and races and ways of living and religions and orientations. Stories that show the myriad ways in which a good human can live in a difficult world, or even what it means to be a good human. I believe that stories are as essential to the human animal as food and water. Storytelling is part of who we are as a species. It is baked into our DNA. One day, many millennia ago, the first talking human walked into a cave or out of a desert and said, "Guess what?" And after that, everybody's ears pricked up and there was no turning back. The first stories did what stories still do, what they have done ever since. They bring us news, they bring us warnings, they bring us information, they bring us humor and joy and sorrow, and sometimes, best of all, they can bring us together. I'd like to share two stories about stories. First, the loveliest letter I ever received from a reader, which arrived a couple of years after my second novel was published. So this would have been about 25 years ago. It was before the internet. This came by actual US mail. This was a thing we had back in the day. I'm speaking to the young people back there. It was handwritten from a woman who had recently gone to Seattle to help her mother out after her father's death, to assist in tidying up his affairs, which were apparently quite complicated and burdensome. She wrote to me that she and her mother had never been especially close, and in fact had a prickly relationship. But one thing they were really good at together and had always liked to do together was to read novels aloud to each other. They had done this since the daughter was a child, and it was the one way the daughter felt they could enjoy their time together peacefully. So after several days of a wake and a funeral and various family coming in and out of town, the daughter found herself alone with her mother one evening. It was raining. The clock was ticking in the background. This woman was very good at setting a scene. And the mother and daughter found they had run out of things to say. So the daughter starts glancing around the room, and on her mother's bookshelf, she spots a copy of my second novel, which she had sent to her mother as a gift for the previous Mother's Day. The daughter says, "Hey, Mom, what did you think of that book?" Thinking maybe they could at least spend some time discussing a piece of fiction. And the mother said, "Oh, actually, I never got around to reading it." At which point, the daughter seized her opportunity, and over the next few evenings, after days spent dealing with the affairs of the deceased, they read the book aloud to each other. Now, in that book, there is a description of a bad marriage and a sudden departure. And as the mother read that scene, she stopped. Instead of reading on, she told her daughter about a tough time in her own marriage to this same father who had just died. And it was something that she had never revealed to another living soul. And this secret became an occasion of bonding between the mother and the daughter. And the daughter was writing to me to thank me for providing the occasion for that to happen. You can imagine how I felt. The second story, I'm 18 years old, a college student in Washington, D.C., very far from my hometown in every possible way. My friend Sally Jacobson and I came into a pair of tickets to hear the poet Rod McEwen, who was a very big deal in the 70s. Who remembers Rod McEwen? Okay, yeah. He was a big deal in the 70s, and he was going to give this reading at Constitution Hall. We didn't know this at the time, but what he was going to read was from his new book of poems that hadn't yet been published, and they were all about the death of his mother. Now, Sally's mother had recently died, and my mother was in the process of dying. So the two of us, these two 18-year-old girls, went to Constitution Hall. I can still see exactly where we were sitting. And we sat together there for an hour and a half, holding hands, crying our eyes out as Rod McEwen spoke directly to our broken hearts. For the two of us in that moment, Rod McEwen was the greatest poet in the history of language. Now, most poets I know consider Rod McEwen a pretty dreadful poet. Sudsy, sentimental, highly commercial, a showman really above all else. But for Sally and me, he was the perfect poet for us in that time and place. The book he was reading from was the perfect book for us in that time and place. Just as my second novel, which is a good novel, but not my best novel, it was the perfect novel for that mother and daughter in their time and place. Books are unbelievably magical in that way. As Harriet says to Violet in How to Read a Book, the writer writes the words, the reader hears or reads the words, and only when those two things meet, the given writer and the given reader, can the book fully exist. And the book is different depending on who the given reader is, what experiences they bring to the reading of that book, where we are in our lives, what triumph or tragedy we may have just gone through. We bring a lot of ourselves to a book. And that's why we all have had the experience of rereading a once loved book and wondering what we ever thought was so great, or conversely, revisiting a book we couldn't even finish, only to wonder how we ever could have missed how great it was. I've come to believe that if I write one book and 100,000 people read it, then I have in effect written 100,000 books. And if I have a reader who reads a book twice, then I have written 2 books for that reader. In that sense, I think of books as living things that take on different properties depending on where they wind up in the world. In 2012, as some of you know, I published a memoir called When We Were the Kennedys, about growing up in the middle town of Mexico. It threads 3 stories taking place in the year 1963. 1, the sudden death of my father. 2, the Kennedy assassination. And 3, a long labor strike at the local paper mill. The town had developed around that mill, which was built at the turn of the 20th century, attracting many hundreds of immigrants who came for these mill jobs. French Canadians with names like Doucette and Theriot, Italians with names like Papsadora and DeConzo, Lithuanians with names like Stasulis and Mortis and Masalski, Irish with names like Murphy and O'Brien and Wood. I'm not sure if this would count as diversity these days. There were almost no racial differences, but there was certainly a great diversity of language and place of origin and cultural tradition. By the time I was a child growing up there, many of my friends had grandparents who spoke only French or only Lithuanian or only Italian or English with an Irish or Scottish lilt. The town had so many different traditions of food and language and music and storytelling. And we kids who went to the same schools were exposed to these various traditions through each other and each other's families. In the school I went to, we learned our prayers in French, in Canadian French, and greeted our teachers every day in French. I insinuated myself so thoroughly in the family of my best friend, Denise Vaillancourt, whose people came from French Canada, that to this day, people who have read the memoir, if it's been a little while, think they recall that I grew up French Catholic rather than Irish Catholic, which I think is hilarious because believe me, there was a big difference. When I went out on tour for this book, a tour that took me across the country and back, I couldn't imagine how a memoir from a place nobody had ever heard of could possibly resonate with readers who had not grown up exactly as I had. I truly believed that the story had no traction outside the borders of Oxford County, and I could not have been more wrong. What I came to understand as I met readers of all ages and backgrounds is that when you tell a family story, you are in one way or another telling everybody's family story. Because we all come from families. And if you come from a family, you will find a door to open in somebody else's story of family. Not everybody opens the same door. Some people said, oh, I loved your book because it brought me back to the Kennedy era and I loved the music and the clothes. And somebody else might say, I completely related because I also come from a close Catholic family. Or somebody would say, I also grew up with a handicapped sibling, so I know what that's like. Or I also came from a company town. We didn't make paper, but we made shoes or buttons or car parts or semiconductors. It continually surprised and delighted me how many people found common ground in a story that I had heretofore thought of as too personal to resonate. But even after I realized how universal this story really was, there were still a few surprises. One of those surprises came in Austin, Texas. It was one of those weeks where I was in Santa Rosa on Tuesday, Milwaukee on Wednesday, etc. And I didn't have time for it to even to occur to me what it meant to be in Austin until I got there and the plane was late and I had to go straight from the plane to the venue. And I'm walking across the stage to the lectern, and I look out and I realize that the audience is mainly students, because this was a college, and that they were mainly children of Mexican immigrants. I was a little nervous about this because the first line of the prologue to When We Were the Kennedys is this: in Mexico, Maine, where I grew up, you couldn't find a single Mexican. And then a few lines later, I described my confusion when learning in the 4th grade that the world included a country called Mexico that had apparently named itself after us. To my relief, both lines got a laugh, and I thought, okay, they're with me. But then things got very quiet as I continued with the prologue, which is a few pages that describe my father's immigrant journey and the journey of so many of the parents in our town, the dreams they had for us, the sacrifices they made for us. Near the end, there's this passage when I'm talking about the paper mill that employed just about every father in town. My father made his living there, and my friends' fathers, and my brother, and my friends' brothers, and my grandfather, and my friends' grandfathers. They crossed the footbridge over the mill's tainted waters, carrying their lunch pails into the mill's overheated gullet 5, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. In every household in town, the story we children heard, between the lines, from mothers, fathers, memes, and pepes, implied in the merest gesture of the merest day, was this: the mill called us here to have you. And as I finished, I'm looking out at this audience. They are decades younger than I am, but I'm looking at them and I realize it's the same story. I'm looking at these kids whose parents came to find something better for their kids. And it was just, I still think of it. I get a little chill every time I think of it. I'm just right back there at these kids who were fulfilling at that moment their parents' dreams for them, just as I, at that moment, being a writer speaking to a group, was fulfilling my parents' dreams for me. It was an unforgettable moment. And the other surprise came not in one place, but absolutely everywhere. At the end of so many of my talks and readings, people came up to me afterwards to say hi or get a book signed or chit chat or whatever. But mainly what they wanted was to tell me who they had lost. That was the one door that every single reader could open. They would say, I too lost my dad when I was 9, or I lost my grandmother when I was 12, or I lost my twin brother when I was 21, or I lost my mother last month and she was 96 years old and I'm still devastated. It was extremely moving, like listening to testimony. And I felt deeply grateful that my book was the occasion for that testimony, and to be reminded that even though we often seem very different from one another, our basic humanity, that is love and loss, is exactly the same. With all this in mind, I want to share with you something I've come to understand about writing. I don't have another area of expertise. I'm not a historian or a scholar, but I do know a thing or two about writing. And one of those things is that writing is an act of empathy. And by empathy, I really just mean the ability to imagine yourself as somebody else. This is what writers do every single day as we try to create characters that we have to get to know very well. Sometimes we do research in order to find that empathy. In How to Read a Book, one of my characters is a machinist, that's Frank. And I felt I needed to walk a few paces in his shoes before I felt I had what I needed to fully create him. I knew a little bit about that world because my father-in-law was a machinist, and my husband, as a young man, worked with him in the shop for about a year. My husband now teaches at SMCC in the Architectural and Engineering Design technology department. So he hooked me up with the precision machining program over there. And for one semester, you have to picture this. It was me and 12, 18-year-old boys and our teacher. I only went once a week. They went 5 days. I went one. But I attended, and I wanted to just get a better feel for the work. So there I was, learning how to set up a milling machine and read a micrometer, to run a lathe. It was really fun, and also learning the more sensual aspects of it, like what steel feels like in your hand compared to aluminum, how it feels to stand in front of a milling machine for 4 hours at a crack. It is very hard on the body. Your feet hurt, your back starts to hurt. And I realized that my character, Frank, must suffer from some sort of chronic pain after doing that work for 44 years. And without that research, I don't think it would have occurred to me that that was part of who he was. For the same book, I gave my character, Violet, a job that I had been waiting for decades to put in a book. As a lab assistant to a behavioral research scientist studying avian cognition in African gray parrots, which is a thing. And there is a researcher, her name is Dr. Irene Pepperberg, which also sounds like I made it up. And at the time I was working on the book, she was at Harvard, and I emailed her and asked her if I could come and meet the birds. And the third time she said yes. I had to kind of cajole my way in there. So I went to meet the birds, and it was just remarkable. These parrots, who are also just wicked cute, they can identify many dozens of objects. They can tell you what color the objects are, what material they are made of, what their shape, if it's triangular or circular or square. They can tell you what vessel holds more or less water. They can tell you what object is bigger or smaller. It is truly remarkable. I also learned, again, with the more sensual, visceral stuff, what it feels like to have a parrot sitting on your shoulder. It's awesome. They weigh about a pound, but it's a kind of very present weight. You know they're there, and they're also extremely warm. Their temperature is something like 109 degrees, I think. So it's this very warm presence on your shoulder. And this is what research brings us to, these whole new worlds of empathy that can really overtake us. I could write a whole book just on these birds. I was so enamored. So yes, writers do a lot of research, but honestly, mostly what we do is just listen to everyone, to the lady behind us in the supermarket, to the guy yelling gibberish on the street corner, to our coworkers in the break room. In other words, we listen to fellow humans stumbling through their lives, telling their stories in 1,000 different ways. In 2021, our country became aware of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, when the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a prosperous Black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street, was torched overnight by a huge and terrifying mob of white supremacists. Its only survivors were now over 100 years old. It's a story that until then was pretty well scrubbed from history, deliberately scrubbed, microfilms destroyed. And even many Tulsans didn't know about it, and even many Black Tulsans didn't know about it. But stories have a way of persisting. One of the Tulsa survivors, a 107-year-old woman named Viola Fletcher, testified in front of a congressional committee on the 100th anniversary. "I still see Black men being shot," she said, "Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I still hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day of my life. Our country may forgive this history, but I cannot. I am 107 years old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. No one cared about us for 100 years. We and our history have been washed away. Her voice was steady and calm and strong. This was a very old woman telling her story, testifying in both senses of the word, testifying before a committee and testifying before us and God about what happened. And it was my job as her listener, especially as her white listener, to not just hear her, but to imagine what it might be like to be her right now telling this. The aches and pains that must surely have accompanied her advanced age, her dimming eyesight as she looked through her rimless glasses at her written testimony. She was wearing these big earphones, I presume because her hearing was faulty. She appeared to be in a wheelchair. So how hard must it have been for her to even get to Washington, to navigate all of those obstacles with her infirmity and her advanced age? Also, she had on a beautiful ring and she was wearing a lovely jacket and lipstick. And I could imagine her looking into the mirror that morning, applying it herself, you know, that feminine fuss that she still had at age 107. In other words, I tried to imagine as far beyond her words as I could, because listening with imagination is not just a writer's territory, it's everybody's territory. And the more we try to do that, the better these stories can be remembered as stories are meant to be. We cannot fully wash anything away as long as stories live. I have a very short poem I'd like to read to you, one that knocks me out every time I read it. And don't worry, it is not by Rod McEwen. It is by Sean Thomas Doherty, and it's about storytelling. It's called Why Bother? Why bother? Because right now, there is someone out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. For better or worse, librarians all over America have been tasked with protecting stories. Whenever they lend out a book, whether it's a legal thriller or an undertold history or a picture book or a Nobel Prize winner, they cannot know who that story is reaching or what that story might mean to the given reader. The given reader might be a daughter trying to connect with her recently widowed mother, or two grieving girls finding solace in mediocre poetry, or a Black child discovering something previously unknown about his own history, or a non-binary person feeling fully seen for the first time. Librarians everywhere are guarding this essential human right, the right to read whatever we want, and I think we owe them thanks for their service. We have no way of knowing which book will fill the shape of a wound for which reader. I can't imagine any reason why someone might target Anne of Green Gables, but right now in this time, I can't be absolutely sure that won't happen somewhere. And now, more recently and disturbingly, librarians are under siege from our own government, which has suspended the entire staff of the Institute for the Museum and Library Sciences, which is the body responsible for funding public libraries. So just like that, funding gets cut. Our main state library has already had to lay off 13 staff members. All this in the public library portion of the federal budget is 0.0003%. Libraries are free, they're for anybody, and no matter who you are, what you look like, where you come from, how much money you make, what neighborhood you live in, nobody in a library will treat you with anything other than welcome and respect. I have already called my representatives and senators to beg them to stand up for public libraries right now, and I hope you will do the same. As a writer, I would have been lost without libraries, from the humble Mexico Library to the fancier libraries that I sometimes visit now. And it is my fervent hope that the writers of the future, the 6-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, the teenagers, will be able to enjoy that same irreplaceable gift. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening. Thank you so much. I will take some questions if you have any. Can I move away, or are the Zoom people looking at me on this?
They're looking, but you're okay to move around a
Okay,
little
sorry, Zoom people.
So if you do have a question for Monica, raise your hand. I will make my way
This one
around.
back there.
We've got one back here. Forgive me as I navigate the furniture.
Oh, thank you.
Wondering how you researched the main character Violet's prison and her encounter session, the sessions they had.
Yes.
It was a wonderful description.
Thank you. So the question is about any research I did for the character of Violet, who is serving time in prison, and Harriet, who is running the book club in prison. I don't really call it research because it's something that I did. So about 10 years ago, for a period of about 3 years, I volunteered at the Wyndham Correctional Center in the women's unit. And I ran, it wasn't a book club like Harriet's, it was a program called Meet the Authors. And I came to it because the Maine Humanities Council, which is also under siege right now, by the way, the Maine Humanities Council did a kind of a one-off book club, and they used one of my books called Ernie's Ark. And I'm very easy to find. Everybody knows where I live. So she called and asked me if I would be willing to come and to speak to the women on their last day of book club. And I said, I would love to. That sounds really interesting. And it was the most excellent book discussion I had ever been in. They were funny and interesting. They had read the book very deeply. They had insights that had not occurred to me before. And I had a really great time. And I remember coming home and saying to my husband, I don't know how to explain this, but I felt completely at home there. Completely at home. Like I just belonged there, and I want to go back and do something. So I put together this program called Meet the Authors. And the idea was it would be 12 women for 12 weeks, and we would read 4 books, all by Maine women authors who are friends of mine. We all know each other. So Maine is a fantastic writing community. It's very friendly. And so I picked 4 books, and they were in 4 different genres. I had children's literature, poetry, science writing, which was a big hit, believe it or not, and personal essay. And so we would read the book for a couple of weeks, and then I would have the author come in the way I had done. And then the author and I would offer the women a writing assignment based on the genre that we had been reading. And the writing part of it turned out to be a huge hit. And with one of the groups I did, it was 12 weeks, but so about half of them would be done at 12 weeks. And some of them wanted to stay on because they got really interested in their writing projects. So sometimes the 12 weeks would be 16 weeks. One time it was 20 weeks. So it was, depending on who was there and what they were writing. And with one of my groups, I persuaded them, not all of them, but 5 of them, to do a public reading for the population. And so they read poems, they did little essays. Some of them were hilariously funny. And we started with a choral reading of Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. You know that poem? Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that ice is also great and would suffice. And the way they did it, I'd have like 1 voice for the first line, 3 voices for the second line, 1 voice for the third, everybody for the fourth. It was really powerful. So we started with that. And the wonderful thing about it was this was at town meeting, which is everybody has to go, and it's in the day room. And it's basically they start with affirmations and then complaints like there's never enough tampons and things like that. And I asked if we could take some time at town meeting to do this, and they said yes. And so the women got up there. They were very nervous, but it was the applause was great. The other women just absolutely loved it. But for me, the experience was watching the COs who were, looking for trouble. That's their job. And so they're kind of looking around. And then I realized they were all looking at the person who was speaking. And that gave me a chill because, they're all dressed the same. That's the whole idea, is to, as Harriet says, to herd them around like a bunch of cows. But that anybody who's ever known more than one cow knows that they are all very different. So anyway, it was a wonderful experience. And if you ever want to feel completely, totally appreciated, volunteer in a prison doing anything. It doesn't matter what you bring. It's really just showing up when you say you're going to show up. That is the thing that you bring. So thank you for that question. Anybody
Anyone
else?
have a question?
Yes.
So how do you get the inspiration that you want to have this thought?
So how do I get the inspiration in advance, if only? I don't start with any ideas at all, really. I usually start with a character who has a problem, and then I just let the language that I'm using take the story where it's going to go. And it's really sentence to sentence. Like if you use a kind of icy word, that it's going to go this way. And if you use kind of a warmer word, it's going to go that way. The process is very hard to describe, but I think of it really as process is basically syntax and word order and word choice. It's the basic fundamentals of our mother tongue. And that's my one and only tool. I'm very glad English is because we have so many more words than other languages do, lots more choices. And that's what I do. I start with really knowing nothing and just take it from there.
Quick question. Once upon a time, you had a pet chicken and you were very enamored
Eddie,
with it.
yes.
It disappeared. Did you ever get another one?
Okay, so this is about Eddie the chicken. Wow, I don't know how these stories get out, but probably I told it to somebody. But my neighbors have chickens in Portland. In Portland, you can have 6 chickens. They also have a rooster, which they're not supposed to have, but she's gorgeous. He is gorgeous. But Eddie was my favorite chicken of the flock, and Eddie would come over and knock on my door to get treats. And Eddie, we called her, she was really a cat because she had 9 lives. And one time, her owners, I called myself the co-parent. We were on text together. If Eddie was out, and like, watch out, there's a coyote in the neighborhood and Eddie's out. But one time Sean is in his kitchen. He looks out the back, which is between my house and his, and a coyote, a young one, comes swooping through the yard, grabs Eddie and disappears into the bushes. And 2 minutes later, Eddie comes out of the bushes with no tail, but otherwise none the worse for wear. So she was an epic, epic chicken, but somebody else has already written about her, and it's my 8-year-old neighbor who wrote a little book called Eddie the Chicken that I have. Yeah. Thank you. I haven't thought of, I didn't know I was going to get a question about Eddie, my Eddie. Yes. The 1 in a million boy, yes. I do. Yes. So this was from a talk I did in Winthrop, which is about writing a draft and then starting all over again. I don't write a whole draft and start over. I write about maybe 50 or 75 pages, which is what it takes to find out what the book is about and who is in it and who they are. And it takes a long time to get to know a fictional character, just like a real person, and so then when I just get rid of all of it and then start on what I call the real page 1. And sometimes it takes a lot of pages to get to page 1, which is what young writers have not as much patience with. They really want the first draft to be the last draft. And it's just, I wish it worked that way, but it just doesn't. I haven't found a shorter way yet. Are we good? Yes. Oh, how long does it take me to write a novel? It usually takes 4 years. It takes 2 years to write the first draft and then 2 years to write the subsequent drafts. Well, in this one, they haven't really. This was 8 years between my first one, but I've been writing plays and things in between. But this one actually took half that time. And partly I'm thinking I'm not getting any younger. I have to start writing faster. So this one only took 2 years, but mainly it was because the character of Violet arrived so fully formed. It's never happened to me before. I just felt like I really knew who she was. And as far as Harriet, she's an older lady who loves books. That was not a big stretch. So this one didn't take as long, but 4 years seems to be the norm, and this one was a little outside the norm. Thank you. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. And if you want to get a book, Barbara's out there, and I'll just stick around here and sign books if you want one signed. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just a couple of final announcements. First of all, the Friends of the Lewiston Public Library annual meeting for 2025 is happening downstairs at 1:30. So if you're interested in finding out what the Friends do and how they help the library, 1:30 down in the couture room. And as Monica mentioned, authors having fond memories of their childhood libraries. I wanted to make sure everybody knew that we are running a capital campaign to renovate our children's library, which is just on the other side of the wall here. We're at $335 or $335,000 raised of the $500,000 or so that we need for the renovation to actually occur. So if anybody is interested in giving or knows someone who's interested in giving, please pass the word along. You can find information on our website. You can contact me, and we'll get you set up. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Monica, for coming to speak with us.